The new Castlevania series on Netflix is pretty darn good. An adaptation of Dracula's Curse, the third game in the franchise, the animation team has done an admirable job bringing the dark, foreboding atmosphere of the game to the small screen. In fact, the only two complaints I have are that the season is way too short and that there is a disappointing lack of any of the music from the original game. But I mean, really, those are just nitpicks. As I watched the first season, I had something like an epiphany come to me. TV is the answer to the perplexing quandary of video game adaptations. Movies based on video games have ranged from just downright terrible to meh, with a very select few like Mortal Kombat earning a cult following. Why is that? Why are comics and books able to make the leap while video games seem to keep running into a wall? I think it comes down to two components every good adaptation must have, and most video game adaptations are lacking. First, a good adaptation needs to maintain the spirit of the plot it's adapting. Second, it needs to translate the spirit of the characters from the source material. The Dark Knight is an excellent example of this. Despite the Joker having a completely different backstory than that of his comic counterpart, and the fact that the film's plot does not follow any specific comic book story arc, the film still succeeds in bringing the spirit of many Batman stories. Batman's belief that he can impose law and order on an absurd world, clashing with the Joker's belief that insanity is the answer to the absurdity of life, is at the heart of many Batman stories, and that's why The Dark Knight succeeds as an adaptation of Batman. It's also why Spider-Man Homecoming has been received so much more positively than the Amazing Spider-Man films. The charmingly nerdy Peter Parker who's bitten off more than he can chew, and whose efforts always seem to manage to take things from bad to worse, that originally resonated with readers of the comics, makes a triumphant return in Homecoming. So this begs the question, why are so many video game adaptations unable to bring the spirit of the games to the screen? Well, the plots of books and comics are received in a much different way than those of video games. They're received passively by the reader. That is to say, they're already written and drawn. All the reader has to do is imagine what they read or see. For the most part, they also follow the three-act structure movie plots tend to, making them much easier to translate to the screen. Video games are a whole different beast. For the majority of games, especially classic games, story serves as little more than connective tissue between levels, a mechanism for pushing the player forward. Much of the power of a story in a video game is derived from the player's feeling of accomplishment they get while playing it. Think back to Castlevania 3. That's a game that you can beat in under 2 hours if you really know what you're doing. But I'm willing to bet that anybody who played it back in the day, especially if they were kids, spent hours upon hours trying to wade through the sometimes downright sadistically designed levels on their way closer to Dracula. Over time, you learned the enemy patterns, your muscle memory adapted, and finally, after Trevor Belmont stood triumphantly at sunrise with one of his companions as Dracula's castle crumbled. Those of you watching this scene with no context likely see a cutesy 8-bit ending and little more. But for those of us who poured our virtual blood, sweat, and tears into this game, this scene instantly brings feelings of elation and triumph. The same is true of games that aren't nearly as difficult, though they accomplish this feeling in a different way. In Ocarina of Time, just before the final showdown with Ganondorf, the camera zooms in on Link and shows his heart containers. This moment serves to remind the player how much they've grown. They've gone from this to this over the hours they've invested in exploring Hyrule. This feeling of progression a player feels in these games is an integral part of both the spirit of the game's plots and characters, and thus it absolutely must be present in any adaptation of a game in order for it to resonate. And that feeling is just really hard to replicate in the space of just 2 or even 3-hour films. But a TV show like Breaking Bad has 45.5 hours spread over 5 seasons in which to really explore the journey its protagonist Walter White takes, from an innocuous chemistry teacher to just a monster. And now we come back to Netflix's Castlevania. In the space of 4 episodes, just under the average 2-hour runtime of a modern motion picture, Trevor has only met 2 of the 3 companions from the game, assuming Grant hasn't just been written out of the series, of course. And the season ends with Alucard declaring that the 3 of them can destroy Dracula as they set off on their journey. I can't wait to see what terror lies around the next corner for our heroes. Season 2 can't get here soon enough, especially since it'll be twice as long as Season 1. The segmented, long story arcs of TV seasons are the perfect place for video game adaptations to bring their source material's feelings of progression, and each episode that ends on a cliffhanger perfectly recreates that feeling of needing to play just one more level to see what comes next. It's no coincidence that Castlevania has become the first video game adaptation that truly rises to the level of not just being passable, but actually pretty great. It captures a piece of its source material that the film never could. It resonates in the same way that games resonated 30 years ago. Now that TV shows seem to be attracting some of the best writers in the industry, and are given budgets and resources to create truly convincing and compelling worlds, the time has never been better for adaptations of classic video games. Now I just wonder if the team behind Castlevania is going to be able to recreate that feeling of frustration that you get when you're trying to jump onto a moving platform and the freaking floating Medusa heads come and they kill you. Go!